Hi, my name is Michaela, and in this video I'm going to be talking about my 1999 Chevy Camaro SS drift car. In this video I'm going to discuss the exact parts and components that went into my car to make it the way it is today, and do my best to try and explain, at least from my perspective, how these different parts affected the way the car feels out on track. I've been drifting this car for about 3 years now, and I think it's to the point where sharing the setup information for it could be very helpful to anyone else trying to drift these cars as well. But do keep in mind, I'm in no way a professional drifter or anything like that, and with drift car setup in general, what I like and what works for me might not be exactly what is best for you. Just to quickly go over the format of this video before we dive into the content, I have it split out into different sections, which if you go to the bar at the bottom, you should be able to see those, so you can skip ahead to whatever's interesting to you. I have it split out into all the different parts of the car, so interior, exterior, front and rear suspension, things like that. If there's something you want to see specifically, you should be able to find it down there. So getting right into it, a little bit of background as to how I even ended up with a Camaro to drift. When I first decided that I wanted to drift, I got on Craigslist and Facebook Marketplace and looked around for different options. There are 3 things I had in mind that I really wanted ideally out of a drift car. Number 1, it had to be budget friendly. I wanted less than $5,000 in 2020, I think is when I was looking for this. Number 2, I wanted something that I wouldn't immediately want to engine swap, so something that had a decent bit of power out of the box. And number 3, I thought it'd be fun to have something a little bit different, so not, another 350Z or E36 or S chassis. No hate for those, obviously they work very well and are going to be good for most people, but I thought it'd be fun to have a bit of a different car. So I was looking online at cars for sale, and it just so happened that the Camaro that I ended up buying popped up for $4,000 for a car that was LS1 with a T56 that seemed to run. It had already been converted into a drift car. It had an e-brake in it. It had cut knuckles. Granted, I did take off the cut knuckles right after I bought the car. That's not to say cut knuckles can't be good. They were kind of the standard back in the early days of drifting from what I've heard. But whenever you buy a used car and you don't know who cut those knuckles and how they welded them, that can be a little bit sketchy because you really need to know what you're doing when you weld cast materials like that. So I saw this car for sale, and initially I wasn't so sure. I thought, no one really drifts these cars. Is this going to be worth the risk? But I saw Kenny Slides do it pretty well on his channel, and that inspired me to take the leap because the car fit all 3 of my criteria, right? It was cheap, it was different, and with the LS1, I mean, it's got more than enough power to get started and have some fun. From there, the Camaro went through quite a few iterations to become the car that it is today. So let's go ahead and get into talking about the setup that I have on my car these days, and hopefully I can give some insight into how these changes made it a better drift car. To start off with, we're going to talk about the drivetrain. The SS trim of these cars came with the LS1 and T56 as the engine and transmission, which is what I have in my car. I would say this is a great first setup for a drift car because it's super reliable and is beefy enough that it can take quite a few drift events without skipping a beat. For the most part, the only real maintenance I did for the engine and transmission was regular oil changes, usually after every 2 events. One thing you do want to make sure of though is that you have some kind of oil baffle in your oil pan. My car had one installed by the previous owner, so I can't say for sure it will blow up if you don't have that, but it's definitely one of those better safe than sorry kind of deals. The EGR stuff has all been deleted, as well as traction control and air conditioning, and the only other thing would be the Volvo power steering pump, so no power steering pump to draw power from the crank. I did make some changes to the cooling system. Cooling is probably one of the most important parts of the car to pay attention to and upgrade for a drift car, and in my case I went ahead and put a DeWitt's radiator in it, which has been pretty nice. It cools it down very quickly whenever I'm coming off the track, so that's been working well. I also have a 160 thermostat in it. The car still has the stock 10-bolt differential in it, which, knock on wood, has been okay so far. It has 410 gears. The 410 gearing has been really nice for larger high-speed tracks like Spirit Peaks, but for smaller, more technical tracks, it can be a little bit challenged. The SS trims of these cars came with a Torsen limited slip differential stock, and that's what I have in my car right now. It's pretty good, although it does have its quirks. When you do some slow speed initiations and things like that, sometimes it doesn't quite lock up the way you'd expect, but for the most part it's pretty good for drifting, and I'd say it's quite good on the street. So that was probably the most basic part of the car. We're going to move on now to the suspension setup on the car, starting with the rear and then moving to the front. For this, I'm going to do something a little bit different. I'm going to initially here tell you about some of the changes we made and how they felt to me as a driver in the car, but truth be told, I'm no expert in car suspension setup, so I'm going to have Ashlen give you more details about some of the technical concepts behind both the front and rear suspension in my car. So starting off with the rear, which is a lot simpler than the front, it has tubular rear lower control arms from Spone, as well as an adjustable panhard bar. And to go with those control arms, it has control arm relocation brackets to compensate for the car being lowered. The car also has some kind of lowering springs in the back, I'm not sure exactly what kind, and some Bilstein shocks that I believe are stock for the SS trim, but also not 100% sure on that. Moral of the story is there's nothing too fancy going on in the back in terms of the springs or the shocks. This is a relatively simple and straightforward rear suspension setup, but it has been very effective for me. In his section at the end here, Ashlen is going to go through why a solid rear axle can actually be quite beneficial for a drift setup, but from my perspective, I've always had grip when I needed it and haven't had any issues with wheel hop. I've also had very even tire wear with this setup, which is very nice for a drift car. Moving into the front suspension, the first thing that I want to touch on here is the angle setup in my car. The first few times I went out and drifted this car, I actually did it on stock steering angle, which I would not recommend for this platform. You might have heard before that some people will recommend learning to drift your car on stock steering angle initially, but with this it's important to keep in mind that different cars will have different amounts of steering angle stock and different steering ratio stock, all of which will factor into how easy or difficult it will be to drift your car in its stock configuration. For example, for my quick research, I saw that 240s and E36s will usually have between 35 to 39 degrees of steering angle stock. In comparison, my car's stock had a little bit less than 30 degrees of steering angle, and C5 Corvettes are even worse at around 25 degrees. These differences might not sound like that much on paper, but this can make it or break it in terms of your experience, especially as a beginner drifter and trying to get a feel for drifting and get up and going. For example, my car trying to drift with a stock steering angle made it very difficult to do things like transition between turns and keep from spinning out. From here, Ashlen designed an angle bracket which bolted on using the wheel hub bolts. This combined with tubular lower control arms gave the car approximately 45 degrees of angle, which was a much better spot for me to start learning how to actually drift with the car. 45 degrees might not sound like a lot compared to a lot of these drift angle kits you see out there today, which offer 60 or maybe even 70 degrees of steering angle, but if you spend a lot of time in drifting, you might hear people say that when you're starting out and trying to learn to drift, you don't want all that angle because you're just going to end up saving yourself from spinning out a lot rather than actually learning how to drift smoothly and work with the car. Overall, my advice for getting started with drifting is to have a bit of a medium angle setup, so somewhere maybe in the high 30s or low 40s degrees of steering angle and a pretty fast steering ratio to get started. The goal is to have enough steering angle to be able to easily control the car, but not so much that you're constantly saving yourself with that extra steering angle that you have and can learn to instead use momentum and learn to smoothly link the whole track before you start getting into using a lot of angle going through turns. I ran this setup for quite a while, I think around 2 years. But eventually, as I became more confident in the car, I wanted more steering angle, and Ashlen and I thought it would be really cool if we developed an angle kit for these cars that got you to around the 60 degrees of angle mark. So with that, Ashlen used a revised version of the angle bracket that I mentioned before, along with some high clearance lower control arms. With the new angle kit and the extra angle it provided, I was able to sustain much higher angle drifts in the car, and overall just have more fun with it, so it was definitely a worthwhile upgrade once I had that knowledge and that driver ability to really utilize that angle. I'm running a prototype version of this kit on my car, and that's what you're mostly going to see in this video here, but we do have a production version of the kit available and for sale under the name Octopus Autosport, and I have a link to that in the description below, and Ashlen is going to talk about it in a little bit more detail in his section later on. A quick note about the prototype kit that's on my car. The main difference between it and the kits that we sell is that it has a lot more range of adjustability, which we use to figure out a good setup for my car, but it's basically set where the production kits would be, so we are going to replace it with a production kit if I do crash or mess up these prototype arms. Just wanted to clarify that there's nothing special about them necessarily, they're just kind of a byproduct of us prototyping and coming up with a design that we wanted. For those of you who are curious about how a setup like this feels on the road, it's actually not as bad as you might think. With all the caster that's in the car, it still tracks pretty straight, especially if you're cruising down the highway or something like that, but it is a bit twitchy. Once you start turning the wheel a little bit, it doesn't take a lot for the car to turn a pretty decent bit. Another important component of a drift car is your front coilover setup. When I bought the car, it came with QA1 coilovers. These coilovers had the highest spring rate springs that are provided with those coilovers, which is only 320 pounds per inch, which equates to a little bit less than 6 kilograms per millimeter. So definitely on the soft side for drifting. The car did have a decent bit of body roll with the softer spring rate, and when I would go to transition pretty aggressively, I'd have to wait for the car to settle before I could move out through the turn. So definitely better than nothing, but not ideal. And unfortunately, there aren't a ton of options for these cars that are a whole lot stiffer in terms of spring rate, so we did something kind of out of the box with this setup. We got some DS series BC coilovers for a 370Z, and Ashlen made a conversion to be able to put those on my car. And overall, I've been really happy with them. They feel pretty good on the street, they're not too stiff, and I actually just went to a pretty bumpy track and it soaked up the bumps really well. The car is much more collected when I go through sharp transitions and things like that. I don't really have to wait on it to move itself around anymore. It just goes kind of where I ask it to go without any kind of body roll or weirdness in that regard. So definitely a very worthwhile upgrade. I think visually you can see it pretty well from outside the car, that it just looks a lot flatter going through transitions, so I think it's definitely worth the extra effort to try to find a good coilover setup for these cars in the front, because it does make a pretty big difference. For reference, the BC coilovers I got have 9K springs in them. If you look them up, you'll see the default is 10K springs in the front, but what I got shipped to me was 9K even though I ordered the default, and it wasn't a big enough difference for me to want to return them and get new ones shipped to me. But if I were to order them again, I'd definitely go for at least the 10 or maybe even a little bit stiffer in the front for these cars. I am running a pretty big aftermarket front sway bar on this car. I'm not sure exactly what brand or size it is, but I personally like running a front sway bar in a drift car just so I don't have to have crazy front spring rates for my coilovers. One thing I will say is if you have a pretty big sway bar in one of these cars, I would recommend upgrading to an aftermarket sway bar mount. I have this one from Detroit Speed, and I actually had the factory one break on me after a drift event, so probably a good thing to do if you do have a big front sway bar. Another thing to touch on, you might have noticed I have these CTSV brakes on the front of my car. Overall, while they are cool, front brakes really aren't that important for drifting, but the main reason I actually got these was because if you notice maybe in this video, the factory front calipers have these big bumps on the back of them that really reduced a couple of degrees of steering angle that I could have in the front of the car. So switching to these CTSV calipers actually got me a bit more clearance and therefore a bit more steering angle. I also thought they were a pretty nice upgrade, especially for the money. They feel quite good because I do street drive and have some fun on twisty roads with this car. Other than that, the car has Heim joints pretty much everywhere in the front suspension, and it has these ARP wheel studs, which I highly recommend getting, especially if you're going to run any kind of sizable spacer. This is really more important for the rear, I think. That's where I'd occasionally run some spacers back when I had narrower wheels, so the fitment didn't look too horrible. But I think getting the long wheel studs, it's way preferable over getting the spacers that have the lugs built into them. Running with this kind of setup, I've never had an issue with a wheel getting loose or coming off, even running some sizable spacers. So that about wraps up the front suspension for the car. At this point, I'm going to hand it over to Ashlen to give you a bit of a technical deep dive on both the front and rear suspension before we continue on with the interior and exterior of the car.
Now, there are several key advantages to running a solid rear axle in a drifting application that I'm going to get into to kind of illustrate them. I have a CAD representation here. This right here is the rear suspension. This would be like a Corvette because it's a double wishbone rear suspension setup, but these same principles would be true with like a trailing arm or like a multi-link rear suspension. The main thing to note is that in drifting, the contact patch of the tire is not deforming from lateral G-load the same way it would in road racing or like an autocross application. Therefore, you don't need the same camber as you would in those applications. Most independent suspension cars have a decent amount of what's known as camber gain under suspension compression. So if I move this down, you can see that the camber increases. And the same thing happens if I roll the car over slightly. Basically, that means that as the car goes around a turn and it rolls, the camber increases on the outside wheel to compensate for the deformation of the contact patch from the G-load. In drifting, since the rear tires are always slipping, the contact patch doesn't deform side to side in the same way. So keeping your tire squared to the pavement at all times is advantageous. This is why the solid rear axle actually has some real advantages. I'll go ahead and add the solid rear axle with a Panhard bar set up here. Now, the solid rear axle just keeps the tires square to the pavement regardless of what the body of the car does. Now you can see I can move this all over the place, and you can see the camber change in the independent representation, but obviously the solid rear axle is just stationary there the entire time. Now, in drifting, typically, or depending on the platform, you would want to run an alignment setting so that when the car is stable in drift, you compensate for all this. So it is something that can be adjusted for in tuning. But the fact that the solid rear axle doesn't need any of that, that it's going to maintain a perfect contact patch in all situations, gives you a lot more freedom as far as your suspension setup and damping settings. Now I've modified this representation slightly to show what you might see on a car running a rear grip kit. Typically what a rear grip kit will do is decrease the amount of camber change in the rear from suspension compression. I'll do my best to drag this straight up and down. It's kind of difficult, but you can see that there's far less change in camber on the rear wheels here as I cycle the suspension up and down. But then if I lean the car side to side, relative to the pavement, there actually is still a change in camber, even with this pretty extreme representation of a rear grip kit. There are still some disadvantages to a solid rear axle for drifting. One of the obvious ones is that there is more unsprung weight. The other is no option for running any kind of tow in the rear of the vehicle. Most people like a tiny bit of tow in, and then in a lot of situations having tow increase with suspension compression can help increase the rear grip of the car. Another big advantage to the solid rear axle is the ease of adjustability in anti-squat. Anti-squat is a pretty key thing to have adjustable in any drift car, and when you're running a solid rear axle, there typically is a large selection of aftermarket components that allow for changes in anti-squat, such as this sort of a setup that Michaela has on her car. If you compare that to something like a Corvette that has double wishbone rear suspension, to change the anti-squat, it requires modifications to the subframe, and basically lowering where the lower control arm mounts to the chassis, which is typically more involved than it would be for a solid rear axle car. Increasing anti-squat affects how the car reacts when you get on throttle in drift. More anti-squat will basically cause the car to lurch forward more aggressively when you get on throttle. Alright, now let's take a look at the front suspension geometry and setup of Michaela's Drift Camaro. Here I have shown the current front suspension that's on there, but I want to start with the near stock geometry of the car. So here we can see the stock lower control arm upright. The first thing that Michaela's car got to increase the angle was this bracket that bolts to the suspension upright. This does, like really any other angle kit, relocates the outer tie rod end in closer to the steering axis. This is what gives the car both a faster steering ratio and more angle before the steering rack reaches its limits. The bracket was on her car for the majority of the time at the lower angle setting, which gives the car about 45 degrees of angle, and with a lower control arm that has the same geometry as stock. We just basically increased the caster and camber as much as possible while not going to a full custom lower control arm. This meant that the car didn't lose very much as far as handling and street manners, but it really added a lot to the driftability of it. And it really let us see that the car really had potential as a drift car. So now for the parts that are on there, it has a custom upper and lower control arm. Both the upper and lower control arm have a lot of adjustability, far more than we thought we might actually need. We just wanted the ability to do a bunch of different setups, test a bunch of different alignments, and really see what the car wanted. Now, as far as the changes we made to the geometry, not talking yet about the angle bracket in this setup, but we wanted to basically both add camber, caster, and increase the track width of the vehicle. These are all really common things that you'd see on most angle kits. The reasoning behind that is, for one, adding camber means that the contact patch on the lead front tire of the car is more square to the pavement when the car is drifting at angle. The weight transfers in drift to the front tire, so it's important to keep that contact patch on the lead tire as square to the pavement as possible. This is what makes the car more controllable when it's stable in drift. Adding caster is also a really common thing on any angle kit, and we added quite a bit to Michaela's car. Caster is what gives the majority of the wheel feedback in the self-steer, which lets the wheel feed to the correct location with minimal input from the driver. So going to these upper and lower custom control arms, the other big thing was actually increasing the amount of angle the car had. The car now has right about 60 degrees of angle at ride height, and to do that, we just moved to the other set of holes on the angle bracket to make the steering ratio even faster, but doing so also meant that there needed to be a lot more clearance because things were going to rub on each other. That's why the control arm is in the shape it is. That's to allow that tire to not rub on the control arm, obviously. And the other thing that we had to do on Michaela's car is the brake caliper here. It wants to really live in the same space as a lot of other things when the car is at angle, including the sway bar, the tie rod, and the mount for the coilover and the coilover itself. That's why Michaela's car is the fixed 4-piston calipers instead of these dual piston calipers. It just was too much to fit in one area for the amount of angle we wanted out of the car. Another common issue that sometimes comes up when adding more and more angle to a drift car is known as over-centering, and this is basically caused when the tie rod end gets to an angle relative to the knuckle, which causes it to bind. One fortunate thing is with Michaela's car, the steering ratio is actually in front of the axle. This is similar to something like an E36. This means that when we increase the caster of the vehicle, moving that lower ball joint forward, it actually moves the tie rod end more in line with the steering rack, and this means that over-centering really isn't as much of a concern as a car that has a rear rack. The rear rack, typically people would run some kind of offset spacer or something to move the rack forward to move it more in line with the axle of the vehicle to prevent over-centering. As far as the bracket itself, the other thing that we've been playing with quite a bit is the amount of acumen the vehicle has. The bracket is designed to bolt to the upright in a way that we can put these spacers behind it. Now these sit between the mounting surface of the bracket and the suspension upright, and they alter the acumen offsets. Adding spacers basically means the steering becomes more and more parallel, and through a little bit of trial and error, we found that we both tend to like the car with about 2 degrees of positive acumen at lock. We have yet to play with any kind of roll center correction. As soon as we switched the car to the BC Racing coilovers with even just the 9K springs that are on it now, and obviously having a front sway bar, the front of the car seems very controlled. It doesn't feel like it needs the suspension geometry to counter the body roll, because there's very little to begin with. One other thing that's adjustable that we haven't really played with too much yet is the motion ratio for the front coilovers on this car. There are multiple holes to change the motion ratio. We've always run it in the stiffest one, which is actually the closest to stock. Since the lower control arm is so much longer than stock, the mounting location for the coilover also has to move outwards to maintain a stock motion ratio. If we were to just add all of the length past where the coilover mounts, it would actually make the suspension quite soft relative to what it was before. Now the current kind of happy alignment spot that we found for the car is 4.5 degrees of negative camber, 6.5 degrees of caster, and then, as I mentioned earlier, right about 2 degrees of acumen at lock, which equates to one of the spacers behind the bracket. Now, this might sound a lot like the kind of alignment you would run on the front of a 350Z, and that makes a lot of sense. The suspension is very, very similar. Having learned a lot from the prototype lower control arms on Michaela's car, we went ahead and made a few of these production lower control arms, both as spares and for anyone else that might want to drift a Camaro. These control arms are lighter and stronger than the prototype ones, but lack the same adjustability. This is because we kind of found the limits of what is useful in adjustability, and these are much more locked in at that set of alignment settings that can actually be good for drifting.
Now we're ready to start talking about the interior of the car. As you can tell by the name of my YouTube channel, I am not the tallest person in the world, and this car was definitely not designed for someone who's 5'2". So we had to get pretty creative to make this car work for me, but also still be an option for Ashlen to drive too. For the driver's seat, we initially retained the stock seat sliders so that we could slide the seat into position for both of us to be able to drive the car, but we found the stock sliders were a little bit more floppy than we'd really like, so pretty recently Ashlen went ahead and used this universal slider kit from Speedway Motors and fabricated a mount to work with that slider and fit in my car. And we also had to make some pretty major modifications to the pedals. We welded on these blocks so that I can fully actuate the clutch and brake, and we had to bend the throttle pedal in a bit so that I can fully press the pedal all the way down. And then for the passenger bucket seat, I just have a planted seat bracket. The car also has a hydraulic e-brake, which came with the car. It's plumbed in line, so it's only one caliper in the back right now. But it's been working pretty decently so far, so I haven't really prioritized doing dual caliper back there yet. One thing I did find that was pretty helpful was to put a pretty aggressive brake pad in the back, which helps the e-brake grab and bite a bit better. If you do get more aggressive brake pads for the back though, make sure you get the same ones for the front, otherwise you could end up spinning the car around whenever you brake hard if you just have much grabbier pads on the rear than on the front. We also went ahead and put this coolant temperature gauge in the interior of the car. For the LS1 cars, all the ones that are 99 or newer, the coolant gauge that's in the dash is actually a dummy gauge, so it's not going to tell you exactly what the temperature is. I've seen it read around 190, 195 on the gauge, and I hooked in HP tuners and saw that it was really at 165, 170, so it can be pretty off, and that can be concerning if it's not telling you exactly when your car is actually getting a bit hotter than it should be. I can't say a whole lot about the cage that's in the car because it was in there when I bought the car, so I'm not quite sure where it came from or anything like that, but it seems pretty decently done, so a nice addition nonetheless. I also relocated my battery to the trunk to make room for my electric power steering pump. To do this, I used this battery box from Summit, which seemed a little expensive for what you get, but it's working pretty well for me, and all the tech inspectors at the tracks always seem pretty impressed with the battery mount situation I have. Ashlen also went ahead and fabricated this really nice fire extinguisher mount, which uses this fire extinguisher, which is actually made to attach to your roll cage, but if I mounted it like it was intended, I wouldn't be able to reach it very easily, especially with how far forward I have the seat, so this is a much nicer solution, which is within reach of both me and my passenger, in case it is needed. And then the last thing I want to mention is this energy quick release I have for my steering wheel, which can be good to note for those of you who are on the shorter side. I think this is the one that adds the least amount of extra length to your steering shaft so that it doesn't come too far into your lap, whereas some of the other ones can add a decent bit of length to that section, and then you end up with the steering wheel being really in your chest. Moving on to the exterior of the car, I really haven't done a whole lot to it. It is a stock SS car, so it has the SS spoiler and hood. The car has depot headlights with the black housing, which I think look really good and have had no issues with leaking or anything like that. The turn signal housings are really cheap ones off eBay, which I have not had as much luck with. I've gone through two on one side because the first one started leaking pretty badly, but they are only about $30 for the set, so it's one of those things where if you buy 2 or 3 sets, you can probably get 2 that don't leak too bad. Like most people who get into drifting, I'm starting to accumulate quite the wheel collection. I like having matching wheels in my car whenever possible, so I've been sticking to the Kansei KNPs in gloss gunmetal. An important thing to note is that the stock wheel lugs pattern for these cars is 5 on 4.75 inches, or that's 5 on 120.65 millimeters. And the wheels I got are 5 on 120, which is a common BMW pattern. So to make this work, I use hub-centric rings, which has worked out pretty well for me. I started out with a set of 4 of these wheels that were 17 by 9.5 with a plus 12 offset. I ran these as a square setup initially, but when we switched to the full angle kit, I needed narrower wheels for the front of the car so that I could utilize all of the angle that the angle kit provided for me. So at that point I got 2 17 by 9 plus 22 offset wheels for the front, and while I was doing that I got 2 more rear wheels. I got 18 by 10.5 plus 12s, and the reason for this is because 18s tend to give you a better range of different tires to use. From what I've seen, finding tires for 17s that are pretty wide, so maybe 275 or something like that, can be pretty difficult, especially since I'm looking for tires that aren't going to break the bank for me. But a 265, 35, 18, for example, is a very popular drift tire size, and there's a lot more options there, so that's why I went for the 18s this time for my newest 2 rear wheels that I got. One quick note I wanted to make is that I'm running these wider tires not so much for grip, but just for tire longevity. The width of the tire, so having a pretty wide tire like a 275 or 285 really makes a much smaller impact on grip than your tread wear rating for that tire. But this car does go through narrower tires a lot more quickly than the wider ones, so that's the reason I try to look for some pretty wide tires. There's a lot more I could say about tires and different ones I've experienced with that I'm going to not get too far into in this video, but feel free to let me know in the comments if you'd like to see another video about just my experience with different tires for drifting. So that about does it for this video. There are just a couple more things I want to say to wrap up here. As I mentioned earlier in the video, I was a little bit unsure going into this how far I was going to be able to take this car, and I'm happy to report that so far I haven't really found a limit in terms of how far this car can take me with drifting. Even at the most challenging events I've gone to, it's been me as the driver that's been the limiting factor rather than the car itself. The car maybe has some disadvantages to some lighter, more flickable cars, but it makes up for it in just the stability it has going through turns, which has really impressed me. And on top of all of that, it has been, I think, one of the most reliable drift cars I've seen around. So overall, even though we had to take a bit of an interesting path to get here, I would say it was very much worth it, and I'm excited to see what the future holds with this car. I wanted to say thank you to everyone who watched and commented on the first video I posted. That video was much better received than I could have ever imagined, and I really appreciated all the positive feedback I got from that. I saw some comments saying that the audio levels were not quite high enough for that video, so fingers crossed, hopefully I address that for this one. But if you guys have more feedback like that, feel free to keep it coming. I just want to hopefully improve my videos as time goes on. Speaking of that, I am hoping to upload on a bit more of a regular schedule than before. It's been over a year since my first video, so I'm hoping to avoid taking giant breaks like that in the future. I do have some ideas for videos going forward here, but if you guys have any suggestions for future videos, feel free to leave those in the comments too. A little bit of a spoiler for the next one, the car is getting more power, so stay tuned for that video if that's something that's interesting to you. And if there's any parts of my car setup that I missed and you're curious about, feel free to send me a message on Instagram. My account will be in the description, or my email as well. I would love to see more of these cars out there drifting, so anything I can do to help you guys out in building your Camaro or Firebird drift car, just feel free to reach out and I'll do anything I can to help. So with that, thanks for watching, and hopefully I'll see you in a future video.